The Galactic Council exiled humanity, Earth quietly became untouchable. Part 1, the vote that ended us. The vote was already over before I stood up. I know that now. At the time, I thought standing up meant something. I thought raising my hand and opening my mouth in that enormous chamber, surrounded by 300 alien species sitting in their curved seats like judges at the end of history, would change something. It did not. My name is Owen Calloway. I was 31 years old when I watched the Galactic Council erase humanity from its records, and I was standing 2 rows behind Admiral Patricia Vasquez when the final count came in. 512 in favor. 19 against. The 19 were the smallest species in the room, the ones nobody listened to. The ones who would remember this moment longer than any of the others. The chamber was called the Hall of Accord. That name should have warned me. Places named after peace are usually where peace goes to be buried. The ceiling rose so high above us that the upper gallery disappeared into a permanent artificial twilight. The air smelled like nothing, scrubbed clean by 100 different atmospheric filters built to keep 500 species comfortable simultaneously. I remember thinking how much money and engineering had gone into making that air, and how the same council that built it had just decided that humans were too dangerous to breathe it. The charge, read aloud by the council's chief arbiter, a tall, silver-skinned being called the Voice, whose actual name no human had ever been able to pronounce, was 7 minutes long. I will not repeat all of it. The important parts were these: humanity was unpredictable. Humanity was expansionist. Humanity had, in the past 60 years of contact with galactic civilization, filed more technological patent challenges than any species in recorded history. Humanity had a biological drive toward conflict that made long-term cooperation unsafe. And then, buried near the end, almost casual in how it was delivered, humanity was developing at a rate that the Council found, quote, difficult to model. Difficult to model. I have thought about those 3 words for 150 years. They were the only honest thing said in that chamber. Every other charge was an excuse. Those 3 words were the truth. We were not exiled because we were violent. Every species has violence in its past. We were not exiled because we were too ambitious. Every species that reaches the stars has ambition folded into its bones. We were exiled because they could not predict us, and unpredictability, to a civilization built on 10,000 years of carefully managed consensus, is the most frightening thing in the universe. Admiral Vasquez did not move through any of this. She stood with her hands clasped behind her back, her dark uniform pressed flat, her silver hair cut close to her skull. She had commanded the human diplomatic mission for 9 years. She had sat in this room for 9 years, watching, listening, learning the rules. She knew them better than most of the species who had written them. And she said nothing. I was not as disciplined. When the arbiter finished the charge and the lights above the voting columns changed from white to the deep amber of a completed decision, I stepped forward and said, loudly enough to carry, on what evidence? The chamber went quiet. Not the polite quiet of people waiting. The sharp quiet of people startled. The Keth ambassador turned to look at me. His name was Vorith. He was tall, pale-scaled, with 4 eyes arranged in a wide arc across his narrow face. He had the expression of someone who had expected a dog to speak and was now deeply inconvenienced by it. He said nothing. He did not need to. The look was the answer. One of the other human delegates put a hand on my arm. A quiet hand. A careful one. I looked over and it was Lieutenant Colonel Diana Ford, our mission's legal officer, and she was not angry with me. She was simply shaking her head very slightly in the way that means, not here, not now, not like this. I stopped. I stood still. I watched the rest of the session happen the way you watch an accident, unable to look away, unable to do anything useful. The reinstatement timeline was set at open. That was their word. Open. It did not mean soon. It meant whenever the Council decided to revisit the question, if it ever did. Our ships would be escorted to the solar system's edge within 30 days. Our diplomatic facilities on 3 neutral stations would be handed to the Council's administrative corps. Our seats at the Accord table would be removed. Physical chairs, carried out by Council staff while we were still in the room. That part was deliberate. I understood that even then. As we filed out of the hall, through corridors where beings from a dozen species moved aside to let us pass, not out of courtesy, I realized, but out of the careful distance you give to something being disposed of. I walked beside Admiral Vasquez. She had not spoken since the session opened. I waited until we were in the sealed transit corridor, just the two of us and Diana Ford and 3 other members of our small team, and then I said quietly, "Admiral, what do we do?" She did not look at me. She reached into the chest pocket of her uniform and took out a small notebook, real paper, bound in dark green cloth, the kind you could buy in any market on Earth for almost nothing. She opened it to the first page. She uncapped a pen. And she wrote something. Then she closed it, put it back in her pocket, and looked at me for the first time since the vote. She said, "We go home." Just that. Nothing about appeals, or allies, or plans. Nothing about anger or shame or the injustice of it. Nothing dramatic. She said we go home, and the way she said it made the words feel like the first line of something rather than the last. Outside the station's main dock, through the thick observation glass, I could see the stars. The same stars that had looked enormous and welcoming when I was a child reading about first contact, imagining the galaxy as a place where we would one day belong. They looked exactly the same. The exile had not changed them at all. Voratha's voice came over the station's general address as we boarded our shuttle, a courtesy announcement that the council wanted us to hear. It informed all residents and guests that the quarantine designation for the Sol system would take effect in 30 days. It used the word quarantine. Not exile. Quarantine, the way you quarantine something sick. The way you contain something you are afraid to touch. I sat down in the shuttle seat and strapped in and looked at the window and thought about that word for a long time. Admiral Vasquez sat across from me. She opened her notebook again. She added one more line below the first. Then she closed it again and looked out the window at the stars and said nothing for the entire journey back to our ship. I did not read what she had written. I told myself it was because I respected her privacy. The real reason was that I was afraid it would be something small and defeated, and I could not bear that, not yet. It was not. I would find that out 150 years later. But that day, in that shuttle, none of us knew what was in that notebook. We only knew what the vote had taken from us, and the silence of a woman who did not seem surprised, and the long, quiet ride back toward a home that was now officially the edge of the known world. Behind us, the Hall of Accord shrank into a point of light and then disappeared entirely. Ahead of us, Earth waited. We went home. Part 2, What We Did in the Dark. The first thing they expected was noise. I know this because 30 years after the exile, when Earth's intelligence teams finally cracked the lower encryption on Council monitoring frequencies, we found their reports. They were clinical and methodical, the way alien bureaucracies tend to be, but buried in the language was a consistent expectation: humanity would respond loudly. We would send envoys, file appeals, contact sympathetic species, make diplomatic noise. They had even prepared a response protocol for it. They had staff assigned. The staff sat idle for 3 decades. My name is still Owen Calloway. I am 61 now. My hair has more gray than brown and my knees give me trouble in the cold, but my mind is sharper than it has ever been, because for 30 years the only thing I have been allowed to do is think. Think, and read, and write memos that go up a chain of command that no longer reports to anyone outside the Sol system. I work for the Sovereign Research Directorate now. Most people call it the SRD. We have no official acronym. We have very little that is official, in fact, because official things can be monitored. What we have instead is work. I want to explain what happened in those 30 years carefully, because the Council's reports described it as nothing happening, and that is the most wrong description I have ever read. Nothing happening is what it looked like from the outside. What was actually happening was the most concentrated and deliberate rebuilding of a civilization that any species has ever undertaken, and we did it quietly, in the dark, without telling anyone. The first decision made after we returned to Earth was not a military one. It was not a scientific one. It was a human one. The leaders of every nation, every bloc, every political entity on Earth, and they argued for 6 months first, because humans always argue, it is not a flaw but a feature, agreed on a single principle: we would not ask for anything. Not reinstatement. Not mercy. Not even acknowledgement. We would not send signals outward except on frequencies too narrow and low power to be worth monitoring. We would pull back our survey missions, recall our deep space vessels, and present the galaxy with the most boring picture we could manage. Meanwhile, underground, we would do everything else. The shipyards came first. Not the public ones. Those were shut down or repurposed to orbital construction that any Council drone could scan and find utterly unremarkable. The real yards were built below the surface of the moon, carved into the regolith over 5 years by teams that rotated so frequently that no single person knew more than their section. It was not that we did not trust each other. It was that we understood, finally, the value of compartmentalization. The Council had taught us something after all. I was assigned to the propulsion division in year 4. My background was in diplomatic linguistics, which made me an unusual choice, but Commander Helena Graves, who ran the SRD's theoretical physics desk with a personality somewhere between a university professor and a person who had been angry for 3 decades and had learned to make that anger very useful, told me that she needed people who understood communication, because the problem with our current FTL system was not the physics. It was the language the physics spoke. Let me explain that in plain terms. The Galactic Council's faster-than-light travel system worked by punching through a specific layer of folded space using a frequency signature that Council-built drives emitted. That signature was their language. Every ship that used it announced itself. Every jump was logged. Every arrival and departure was visible to any monitoring station tuned to that frequency, and the Council had monitoring stations everywhere. You could not use their FTL without them knowing exactly where you were going. We did not build a better version of their system. We built a different one. Helena spent 11 years on the core theory before she showed it to me. I remember sitting in her office, a gray, cluttered room 300 meters below the lunar surface, lit by strips of warm light that she had insisted on because she found blue-white lighting hostile, and watching her draw equations on a physical whiteboard with an actual marker because she did not trust screens for early-stage thinking. The principle she had found was this: the Council's system moved through folded space by forcing it open. Our system moved through folded space by agreeing with it. By matching a signature that the fold already produced naturally, we could slip through without announcing anything. No frequency pulse. No logging event. Just a ship, here one moment, somewhere else the next, and no record of the journey. It was slower. About 40% slower than standard Council drives over long distances. Helena was not happy about the 40%. She complained about it regularly, the way she complained about everything that was not yet perfect. But she agreed with me when I pointed out that 40% slower and invisible was worth more than any speed at all on a drive that announced your position to every monitoring station in the galaxy. We called it the fold match drive. The name was not exciting. Helena said exciting names attracted attention, and she was right about most things. The years of building it were not glamorous. I want to be clear about that because stories have a tendency to make difficult periods seem charged with energy and purpose. Some days it was. Most days it was engineers arguing about tolerances and materials scientists running the same test for the 40th time and programmers rewriting navigation code that kept producing outputs that were technically correct but would have sent a ship sideways through a gas giant. What kept us going was the culture that had grown up around the work. I noticed it gradually, then all at once, the way you notice weather changing. Art on Earth had shifted. Not by government direction, no one had ordered it, but by something that felt like collective instinct. The music coming out of that period was long, structural, patient. The novels were about waiting with purpose. The films were about people who made decisions whose consequences only appeared decades later. The words that showed up most often in every piece of creative work produced in those 30 years were, prepare, endure, remember, and eventually. Eventually was a promise, not a wish. The difference matters. In year 26, something happened that was not planned. A Council trade vessel crossed into the Sol buffer zone. The buffer zone was a region of space about 2 light hours out from Earth that the Council's Exiled decree had marked as the boundary of our confinement. The vessel's transponder identified it as a merchant runner registered to a species called the Velhari, small, economically cautious, not known for provocation. It had wandered off its scheduled lane due to a navigation error, according to its logs. Earth's response was handled by Captain Grace Ellison, commander of the patrol vessel Callaway. Yes, they had named a ship after me, which I found both touching and slightly embarrassing. Grace was 43, calm in the way that people who have spent decades in the quiet of space become calm, and she opened a channel to the Velhari ship and explained, very politely, that they had crossed into a designated sovereign zone and would need to return to their registered lane. The Velhari captain was confused. He had expected to find nothing out here. Empty space. The sad remnants of an exiled species watching their technology slowly fall apart. Instead, he found a patrol vessel he had no record of. A design he had never seen. Using a communication frequency his system struggled to lock onto. Crewed by humans who spoke to him without any of the anger or bitterness he would have expected from a people who had been locked out of the galaxy for 30 years. Grace gave him the escort back to the lane boundary and wished him good travels. The Velhari captain filed a report with Council Customs. It was flagged, reviewed, and eventually produced a memo that read, in part, the Sol system patrol capacity appears minimal but functional. Vessel design is non-standard but non-threatening. Recommend continued monitoring at current levels. Helena laughed for about 4 minutes when I showed her that memo. Minimal but functional. She had given 22 years of her life to the program at that point. Non-threatening, she said, still laughing, pointing at the memo. They have no idea what that ship was carrying. She was right. Grace's vessel was one of 7. The other 6 were running fold-match drives in test configurations across the outer system. The Council's monitoring stations, tuned to standard Council drive frequencies, had not detected a single one of them in 8 months of continuous operation. The Keth submitted their own intelligence assessment around the same time. It was thorough and professionally written and concluded with a line that I have kept in my files ever since because it is, in my view, the most perfectly wrong sentence ever produced by an advanced civilization. Earth appears stable. Threat level, negligible. I have read that line probably 1,000 times. It never gets less satisfying. The year after that assessment was filed, we launched our first deep space vessel on a fold-match drive. It was called the First Step. The name, unlike fold-match drive, was very much on purpose. Helena picked it. I had thought she only liked boring names. Turns out she was selective. The First Step went out past Neptune, folded, and appeared 3 light-years away without producing a single detectable pulse. We did not celebrate loudly. We did not broadcast anything. The team gathered in the main lab below the lunar surface and someone opened a bottle of wine that had been kept for this moment for 11 years, and we drank from paper cups and Helena stood with her back against the whiteboard where she had first drawn the equations and looked at the ceiling for a long time. Then she looked at me and said, simply, 30 years of nothing. Let's see what comes next. What came next was not nothing. What came next was the part where the galaxy started to notice that the quiet corner of space where they had put humanity was not, in fact, staying quiet. It was only asking us to come to it. Part 3, the smaller species come knocking. The Yulari did not send a formal request. They sent a woman. Her name was something I could not reproduce with a human throat, but she told me to call her 6 because her name in human phonetics sounded closest to the number, and she found that practical rather than strange. She arrived at the outer buoy station, a small pressurized platform we had placed just inside the Sol buffer zone, officially listed in our own records as a weather monitoring node, in a single-occupant shuttle that was older than some of my colleagues and held together by what appeared to be optimism and careful welding. I met her there with a translator unit and 2 cups of tea, because we had learned early that offering food or drink was one of the very few gestures that crossed species lines without causing offense. 6 accepted the tea, studied the cup for a moment, and then put it down and said, "Our colony world is dying. The Council has our terraforming request in queue position 2841. We have been in queue for 73 years. We calculate that by the time they reach our position, there will be no one left to benefit from the work." I said, "How long do you have?" She said, "The soil failure is already past the 2nd threshold. 14 years before full desertification. Maybe 12 if the next storm cycle is bad." I said, "And you came to us." She looked at me with her wide, pale eyes. Yulari eyes were adapted for dim light, large and almost perfectly circular, and said, "We came to you because everyone else in the Council ignored us for 73 years, and you are the only civilization in this region of space that has ever been ignored by the same people. We thought you might understand what it feels like to be put in a queue and forgotten. I have heard many arguments for alliance in my career. That one was the most honest. I was 68 years old by then, 80 years after the exile, and my title was Ambassador without Portfolio, which was the SRD's way of saying that I was the person they sent when they needed someone who knew how to talk to people without setting anything on fire diplomatically. It was not an exciting title. It was an accurate one. 6 visit was not the first contact we had received from non-council species. It was the 4th. The Drevathi had reached out in year 61 with a medical supply request. They had a respiratory illness moving through their southern continent that council pharmaceutical channels could not address quickly enough, and they had heard, through sources they declined to name, that human medical research had developed something that might help. We had helped. We asked for nothing in return, which confused them so much that their lead diplomat had asked me to repeat it 3 times. The Sulcan had come in year 72, not for emergency help but for a meeting. Just a meeting. They were a careful species, cautious and deliberate, and their ambassador, a broad, gray-furred being named Kevsol, who spoke in long sentences and paused between each one to think, had wanted to understand us before asking anything. We talked for 4 days. At the end he said, "You are not what the council described," I said. "What did they describe?" He said, "A cautionary tale," I said. "And what are we?" He said, "A possibility." The Kevsol visit had produced nothing concrete. It had produced something better, the beginning of a relationship between 2 civilizations that had both been treated as afterthoughts by the same organization. But the Yulari situation was the most urgent we had faced. 12 to 14 years before a colony world became uninhabitable was not a long window. Terraforming at that scale was not something we had done outside our own system. Our teams had experience with Mars, with a handful of outer system bodies, with theoretical models that had not yet been tested against another species world with different atmospheric chemistry and different soil biology. Helena, who by now was 91 and refused to retire on the grounds that she had not finished being useful, listened to my report from 6 visit and said, "Give me 6 years." I said, "She said 14. Some models say 12. Helena said, "I know. Give me 6. That's what I need to do it right." I transmitted the offer to 6, who transmitted it back to the Yulari Planetary Council, who took 48 hours to respond, 48 hours that I spent walking around the outer buoy station trying not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. Their response was, "Yes. Please. And also, what do you want in return?" I had prepared for this question. I had discussed it with the SRD Council, with Helena, with 3 other senior staff whose opinions I trusted. We had agreed on an answer that would surprise them, because in the galactic civilization we had observed, nothing was ever done for free between species of any consequence. I told 6, raw materials. Access to the asteroid mining fields in your outer system that the Council has not licensed. Astronomical mapping data from your region of space, which our instruments cannot yet reach. And one thing that is not material at all, the knowledge that if we ever need to speak to someone, you will answer. 6 was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "That is less than we expected." I said, "Most things humans do are less than people expect. That's one of our better qualities." She almost smiled. I think. Yulari facial expressions were subtle enough that I was never entirely certain, but the motion around her eyes looked like something warm. The terraforming mission to Yulari 4 left 16 weeks later. It was led by a young geoengineer named Callum Ward who had spent his entire career building models that he had never had the chance to apply at full scale. He was 34, intensely focused, and slightly alarmed by the size of the job. He told me the night before departure that he was not sure they could do it. I told him that the Council had put the Yulari in a queue for 73 years. I told him that somewhere on Yulari 4, people were watching their soil go gray and their rivers run thin and their crops produce less each year, and they had no help coming from anyone except a species that the galaxy had officially decided did not matter. Callum looked at me for a moment and then said, "Right. Okay." He left the next morning. 6 years and 4 months later, Yulari 4 registered its first full successful growing season on the new soil matrix. We did not advertise this. We did not send announcements to the Council channels. But news travels in the galaxy the way water finds its level, along paths of least resistance, through the small conversations between traders and station staff and the lower-level functionaries who nobody important pays attention to. Within a year of the Yulari result, we received 7 more requests from species on the Council's periphery. The work expanded accordingly. Drevathi medical teams began collaborating directly with human researchers. The exchange went both ways. They had knowledge of biological systems that we had not encountered before, and the combination produced results that neither side could have reached alone. The Drevathi lead researcher, a compact, warm-voiced being named Artef, said during one of our sessions, "I have worked in council-affiliated labs for 30 years. In council labs, knowledge is owned. Here, it is just used. This is better." The Sulcan reactor program was the largest undertaking. Kevsol's world had an energy production problem. Their primary resources were deep geothermal, which was difficult and dangerous to access with their existing technology. Human engineers had developed a hybrid system during the isolation years that was more efficient at depth extraction than anything the Council standard offered. We built 4 of them on the Sulcan home world over 3 years. The work crews lived in a small compound outside the Sulcan capital. They were the first humans many Sulcan had ever seen in person. Kevsol told me afterward that the most surprising thing had not been the reactors. It had been watching the human crews work. He said, "They argue with each other constantly. They disagree, they raise their voices, they stop for something called lunch far more often than seems efficient. And then they solve the problem. Every time. I had been told humans were dangerous because they were chaotic. I think the Council misunderstood. The chaos is the method." I have thought about that sentence a lot. I think he was right. By year 90 of the Exile, our informal network included 11 species. No signed treaties, no formal alliance documents. We had learned from the Council that formal agreements were as useful as the bodies that enforced them, and we had no interest in building another council. What we had instead was a web of favors, collaborations, shared projects, and the kind of trust that grows between people who have helped each other when help was not guaranteed. The Council noticed. It would have been impossible not to. Our trade signals, while narrow, were visible if you were looking. Our ships, still running fold match drives, still invisible to standard monitoring, but present in systems that Council charts flagged as off-limits for exiled species, began appearing in patrol reports. Their legal team drafted a resolution to extend the terms of our exile. Specifically, they wanted to bar us from operating within 50 light-years of Council member systems, which would have cut off most of our network's working range. The resolution needed a 2/3 majority. It received 41%. The abstentions came from species whose worlds ran on human-designed reactors, whose colony planets had been saved by human terraforming teams, whose medical research was co-authored by humans and quietly published through their names because we had no publication channels of our own. Not one of them stood up in the chamber and said, "We are doing this because humans have helped us." They simply did not vote to damage something they had come to value. In politics, that is the same thing. Vorith delivered a speech after the resolution failed. I received a transcript of it 2 weeks later through channels I will not describe. He said that the Council was witnessing the formation of what he called a shadow network, a deliberate attempt by humanity to undermine galactic order through the corruption of weaker species. He used the word corruption. Callum Ward, at that moment, was on his way back from Yulari 4. He had gained 5 kilograms from Yulari cooking, which he described as the best thing that had happened to him professionally. Six sent me a message after the resolution failed. It was 3 words long. It said, "You were right." I wrote back, "About which part?" She wrote, "All of it." I did not tell Helena about the resolution until a week after it failed, because I knew what she would say and I wanted to enjoy the quiet for a little while before her commentary filled the room. When I told her, she was exactly as I expected. She listened to the full account, including Voritha's speech and the word corruption, and then she leaned back in her chair. She had the same chair she had used for 30 years, refused every replacement, held it together with hardware she replaced piece by piece herself, and said, "Shadow Network." I like that. I said, "It is not a compliment." She said, "Most useful things aren't." Then she picked up her marker and wrote something on the whiteboard, which she had now filled and erased and refilled so many times that the surface was permanently faintly gray. She wrote, "Phase 3. I looked at it. I said, "What's Phase 3? She said, "The part where they realized they should have left us alone." Part 4, The Line in the Dark. The Keth fleet arrived at Yulari Space at 0340 station time. I was not asleep. I had not been sleeping well for 2 weeks, because our long-range fold-match sensor array, a system Helen's team had finished 3 years earlier, quiet and precise and invisible to anyone not using our own detection frequencies, had been tracking unusual mass movement in Keth patrol sectors. The pattern was not random. Patterns never are, if you look long enough. I was sitting in the operations room of our forward coordination station, a compact facility we had placed at the edge of the Yulari outer system, officially classified in our own records as a communications relay, because officially classified things are easier to explain to visiting dignitaries when the alert came through. 11 Keth warships. 3 cruiser class, 4 patrol frigates, 4 support vessels. Moving in a standard punitive formation, the kind the Keth used when they wanted to deliver a message with enough weight to be felt through the hull of a station. Their transponders were active. They were not hiding. Why would they hide? Yulari space was undefended, as far as any Council intelligence file said. It had never needed defending before. Captain Grace Ellison, still commanding, gray at her temples now, as calm as she had been 30 years earlier when she politely escorted a lost Velhari merchant back to his lane, was already on the channel when I reached the command deck. She was not in the Yulari system. She was 3 light minutes out from the Keth fleet's arrival point, running dark. And she was not alone. 11 human frigates, all fold-match capable, all built in the lunar yards over the previous 15 years. None of them in any Council database. None of them producing a single detectable emission on standard monitoring frequencies. None of them visible to the sensors the Keth fleet was using to scan the space ahead. Grace watched the Keth fleet decelerate into the outer Yulari system, watched them slow with the confidence of ships that expected no resistance, and then she opened a channel. The Keth fleet received the signal. They had no idea where it was coming from. She said, "This is Captain Grace Ellison of the Earth vessel First Resolution. You have entered Yulari sovereign space. You have 40 minutes to return to the boundary. This message is a courtesy. The next one will not be. I have the recording. I have listened to it perhaps 200 times. What stays with me is not the words but the tone, the complete absence of any performance in it. No anger, no threat shaping, no dramatic pause. The words landed flat and even and final, the way a fact does. There was silence on the Keth channel for 47 seconds. I counted. Then the lead Keth commander, his name, we later confirmed from their own records, was Darav Khan, a senior fleet officer with 30 years of service and a record that was, by Keth standards, distinguished, responded. He said, "Identify your position." Grace said, "No." Another silence. 22 seconds this time. Darav Khan said, "You are in violation of Council exile terms. Earth vessels are not authorized to operate beyond Sol system space." Grace said, "We are not currently bound by terms that were applied without our consent and never accepted by our government. I note for the record that this is not a Sol system location. This is Yulari space, which has its own sovereign authority. You were not invited." I want to pause here because this moment is important and it is easy to underestimate it if you focus only on what was said. Darav Khan was not afraid of Grace Ellison's words. He was afraid of the word's source. He could not find her ship. He could not find any of the 11 ships he was now certain must be present, because the channel quality and transmission characteristics told him that the sender was close, within a few light minutes at most, and his sensors showed him nothing. Nothing at all. No mass signatures. No drive emissions. No hull reflections. Nothing. He had spent his career operating in a galaxy where every ship was findable. Where every vessel had a signature that your systems could locate and identify and classify in the time it took to request the data. The assumption that space was legible, that if a ship was there, you could see it, was so deeply embedded in Keth military doctrine that there was no protocol for its absence. His sensors told him he was alone. His ears told him he was surrounded. He said, "We are here on Council authority, acting under Council mandate too." Grace said, "You have 38 minutes remaining." Darav Khan stopped speaking. I could hear, on the open channel, the sounds of a command deck being asked questions that its systems could not answer. I heard someone say a Keth word I did not know. Our translator unit flagged it later, the closest equivalent was ghost. They used it more than once. 11 minutes passed. The Keth fleet held position. They were not advancing, but they were not retreating. Darov Khan was calculating, the way a careful commander calculates when they have run into an unexpected situation, assessing, gathering whatever information the situation would provide, trying to build a picture from incomplete data. At the 11-minute mark, one of the Keth patrol frigates fired a ranging shot. Not at a target. Into open space, in the direction the channel signal seemed to originate from. A sensor pulse, essentially. A way of illuminating what the standard sensors could not see. The pulse hit nothing because the frigates of the first resolution were not where the pulse went. They were elsewhere, spread in a formation that Grace had designed over 3 years of running scenarios, in positions that made them maximally useful and minimally predictable. But the pulse did hit one thing, a small automated drone that our sensor network used as a signal relay node. The drone was not a weapon. It was not a ship. It was about the size of a large suitcase, and it was designed to absorb and re-emit signals in a way that made our communication appear to come from many different points simultaneously. The pulse hit the drone, and the drone did something it was designed to do in the event of an energy impact. It re-emitted the energy in a tight, shaped wave that our ship's receivers were calibrated to recognize. From the Keth fleet's perspective, an invisible object in empty space had just absorbed an energy pulse and redirected it with precision. Darov Khan said, on the open channel, "What was that?" It was not phrased as a question. Grace said, "That was a sensor node. We have several in the area. I mention this not to alarm you, but because your ranging pulse damaged it and we will need to file a maintenance request, which is administrative work that I find tedious." There was a longer silence. Grace said, "You have 22 minutes. I have spoken to Darov Khan once, many years later, in a context that would take too long to explain here. He was retired by then, working as an instructor at a Keth Naval Academy. I asked him what he had been thinking in those 22 minutes. He said, I was thinking that I had no information. I had trained for 30 years in an environment where I always had information. Even against enemies I had never fought before, I had data, mass, emissions, drive signature, crew capacity, weapon hardpoints. I had nothing. I could not plan without data. So I was thinking about what the absence of data meant. I said, what did it mean? He said, it meant that whoever built those ships had spent a very long time thinking about how to fight people like me. He was right. Helena and her team had spent exactly that long. And they had decided, early on, that the best way to make a ship untouchable was not to make it stronger. It was to make it unknown. At the 18-minute mark, Darov Khan ordered his fleet to hold. At the 14-minute mark, he ordered a partial withdrawal, pulling his support vessels back toward the boundary while the warships held. At the 9-minute mark, he made the full decision. The Keth fleet turned. All 11 ships. In a maneuver that was controlled and deliberate and, if I am being fair to Darov Khan, dignified, he did not scatter, he did not show obvious panic, he brought his fleet around in order and moved it back toward the boundary at a pace that could be described as measured. Grace watched them go. Then she opened the channel one last time. She said, "Boundary confirmed at your current heading. Safe travels." That was all. I sat in the operations room with my hands flat on the console and felt something move through me that I do not have an exact word for. It was not triumph. It was not relief. It was something older and quieter than both of those things. It was the feeling of watching a proof completed, a long, careful piece of reasoning that had started 30 years ago in a shuttle leaving a space station, written in one line in a small green notebook by a woman who had known, even then, what the answer was going to be. We had not fired once. Not one shot. Not one energy discharge directed at an inhabited target. No crew member was injured. No ship was damaged except for one sensor drone that had already been scheduled for maintenance. The Keth fleet left Yulari space and did not return. 3 days later, the Galactic Council called an emergency session. Earth did not attend. We sent no message, no diplomatic note, no representative of any kind. I thought about Admiral Vasquez, who had died 7 years earlier at the age of 93, in a small house on the northern coast of England. I thought about the way she had said nothing at all in that shuttle, and then at the end, 2 simple words. I thought that she would have found the silence appropriate. The council session produced a formal inquiry into the Keth fleet's unauthorized entry into Yulari space. It produced 3 competing resolutions, none of which passed. It produced a great deal of transcript that our analysts spent weeks reviewing. And somewhere in the middle of all that transcript, buried in the floor discussion that followed Daravkan's classified report about what he had encountered, was a single sentence from one of the smaller council members, a species called the Mirren, who had been on the council for 300 years and were generally considered the most careful and analytical minds in the chamber. The Mirren representative said, very quietly, into the official record, "I believe we need to reconsider our assessment of the Sol system." No one responded. The session moved on to other business. But I kept that line. I have it still. I keep it in the same file as the Keth intelligence assessment from 30 years earlier, the one that said threat level, negligible. I put them next to each other. I read them together, sometimes, when I need to remember what patience looks like over a long enough timeline. In the outer Yulari system, Callum Ward's terraforming teams were preparing for their third season of work on the expanded coastal growing zones. Six had sent me a photograph of the first green field. She had not written anything beneath it. She had not needed to. Earth was quiet. Earth was always quiet now. And quiet, I had learned, is not what small things are. Quiet is what untouchable things choose to be. Part 5, the council asks to talk. They kept us waiting. Not at the door, not in a corridor, they were more civilized than that, or they wanted to appear so. They sent a formal advance party, 3 junior diplomats in council dress, to our outer buoy station with a sealed request for dialogue. They handed it to the station officer with their eyes slightly downcast, which is not a submissive gesture in most species, but in the formal context of council protocol it is the closest thing they have to one. The request asked if Earth would be willing to receive a senior council delegation at a location of Earth's choosing, at a time of Earth's convenience, to discuss, and I am quoting from the official text, the possibility of renewed participation in galactic cooperative structures. I read it 3 times. Then I set it down and went for a walk. My name is still Owen Calloway. I am 184 years old. That is not a typographical error. Human medicine in the isolation years had nowhere to go except inward, and the results were considerable. I do not feel 184. I feel tired, sometimes, and slower than I used to be, and my memory for small things has developed the irritating habit of filing them somewhere I cannot immediately find. But my memory for important things is perfectly intact, and the most important thing I remember is a chamber in a space station where the ceiling disappeared into artificial twilight, and a vote, and the sound of chairs being physically removed while we were still in the room. I went for a walk and I thought about that, and then I thought about what Admiral Vasquez had written in her notebook, which I had finally been permitted to read after her death, and which had contained exactly 2 lines. The first line, "They are afraid of what we will become." The second line, "Give them 150 years." It had been 153. We let the council's advance party wait 3 days before we responded. This was not rudeness. It was information. They needed to understand, before the first conversation began, that we were not eager. Eagerness is a disadvantage. It tells the other side how much you want the outcome, and how much you want the outcome tells them how much pressure they can apply. We were not eager. We had not been eager for 153 years. We chose the location. Earth. Not a neutral station, not a shared facility, not some carefully managed diplomatic no man's land designed to make everyone equally uncomfortable. Earth. The planet they had locked away and called a quarantine zone and expected to find withered and desperate and grateful for any attention. We held the meeting in a building that had been constructed specifically for this purpose 30 years earlier, when Helena had looked at me across her lab and said Phase 3, and I had finally understood what she meant. The building was made partly of stone, ordinary grey stone, quarried from a mountainside in Scotland, and partly of a dark composite material that was a byproduct of the fold match drive manufacturing process. It sat on a hill outside what used to be called Inverness, with windows that faced west toward the Atlantic, and it had no name. We called it simply the Hall. The council delegation arrived by standard FTL, because they did not have fold match drives and did not know how to build them, and they emerged from their transit point into the Sol system to find 4 human vessels waiting to escort them in. Not as an intimidation display. As a courtesy. The human word for this is hospitality, and we had decided that we would be hospitable, because hospitality from a position of strength is one of the most unsettling things you can offer to someone who expected hostility. The delegation was 17 beings. Vorath was among them. He was older. The scaling on his face had gone from pale gray to a deeper, almost charcoal tone, which in Keth biology indicates advanced age. He moved more carefully than he had in that council chamber 153 years ago. He was still upright, still precise in his manner, but the quality of the precision had changed. It was the precision of a being who had learned, over a long life, that precision is all he had left to rely on. He looked at me when we met in the hall's entrance, and he held the look for a moment longer than protocol required, and I thought I saw something in his face that was not contempt and was not apology but was something between the two, a recognition of a long distance traveled, perhaps. A kind of reluctant accounting. I said, "Ambassador Vorath. Welcome to Earth." He said, "Mr. Calloway," a pause. Then, "You look well." I said, "I have had a productive century and a half." "Come inside." The meeting table had been built to accommodate 32 beings of various physiologies. We had designed it that way because we expected the council to bring more representatives than they actually needed, as a show of institutional weight, and they did not disappoint. 17 actual delegates, plus a ring of aides and technical staff and security personnel that brought their total to 31. We brought 5. 5, including me. The delegation head, a legal officer named Priya Morton, a senior analyst named Henry Cage, a materials engineer named Ruth Dallow who was there because she had built 3 of the reactors currently running in Sulcan space and the council needed to understand what that meant, and one other person who sat at the far end of the table and said almost nothing for the entire first session. Her name was Callum Ward's daughter, a woman named Alice Ward, who at 47 years old had already overseen the terraforming of 4 worlds and had a quiet reputation among the non-council species as the person you called when a situation was beyond what the official channels could manage. She had her father's focus and her mother's patience, and she watched every member of the council delegation in turn with the steady attention of someone taking very careful notes in their head. The council's opening position was generous, in the way that a person is generous when they have realized they need something and are trying not to show how badly. Full reinstatement. A voting seat in the general chamber. Access to all standard council communication frequencies and FTL lane codes. Removal of the quarantine designation from Sol System and all adjacent territories. A statement acknowledging, without specifying details or assigning fault, that the original exile order had produced, quote, suboptimal outcomes for galactic cohesion. Suboptimal outcomes. I looked at Priya Morton when that phrase was delivered. She looked back at me with an expression that communicated, without words, that she was maintaining her composure through professional discipline alone. Our response was delivered by me, because I had drafted it, and because there was a certain symmetry in the same person who had stood up in that chamber 153 years ago and said on what evidence being the one to speak now. I said, Earth's position requires the following as the basis for any renewed relationship. I said, 3 permanent seats on the General Council, with veto rights on any resolution that directly affects Sol System interests or the interests of any species currently in cooperative relationship with Earth. I listed the species. There were 31 of them. The council delegation heard the list and several of them became very still in the way that beings become still when a number is larger than they had prepared for. I said, full mutual trade access on terms equivalent to those offered to founding council members, not the secondary access tier available to associate species. I said, a formal written apology for the exile, entered permanently into the galactic record, unambiguous in language, not subject to future administrative revision. I said, recognition of Earth's autonomous jurisdiction over all technologies developed during the exile period, including drive systems, medical applications, and terraforming methodologies, with licensing terms set exclusively by Earth. I said, the immediate release from Council Q of all terraforming, medical, and infrastructure requests filed by species currently in cooperative relationship with Earth. 31 species. Several hundred outstanding requests. Some of them 70 years old. I set the document down on the table and left it there. The council delegation asked for a recess. We gave them 4 hours. During those 4 hours, I sat in a small room off the main hall and looked out the window at the Atlantic and thought about a great many things. I thought about the howl of a chord and the artificial twilight and the sound of chairs being moved. I thought about Grace Ellison saying you have 40 minutes remaining in a voice with no performance in it. I thought about Callum Ward saying right, okay, the night before he left for Yulari 4. I thought about 6 3-word message. I thought about Helena writing phase 3 on a whiteboard in a room 300 meters below the moon. I thought about Patricia Vasquez, standing with her hands behind her back, not moving, not speaking, already knowing. Priya Morton came to find me 20 minutes before the recess ended. She sat down in the chair across from me and looked out at the water. She said, "They are going to accept." I said, "Yes." She said, "Not all of them willingly." I said, "Willingness isn't required. Agreement is." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Vorath is the interesting one. He's not angry." I expected angry. I said, "He's been in that council chamber for 150 years watching something go wrong that he cannot undo. Anger would be easier. What he has is worse." She said, "What does he have?" I said, "Understanding." She thought about that. Then she nodded slowly and stood up and straightened her jacket and said, 4 minutes. We went back in. The council's response came from their delegation head, a being called Senior Arbiter Thren, of a species called the Velmara, who had a reputation for scrupulous fairness that had survived multiple council scandals and was generally considered the closest thing the institution had to a conscience. Thren was slow and careful in speech, the way that beings are when they have learned that words once said cannot be retrieved. Thren said that the council was prepared to accept the terms regarding seats, trade access, and autonomous technology jurisdiction. Thren said that the apology language required further internal deliberation but that the council was, in principle, prepared to address the historical record in a manner that Earth would find satisfactory. Thren said that the outstanding requests for council-affiliated species were a more complex matter requiring administrative coordination but that the council would commit to a 3-year resolution timeline. Then Thren said, "The council wishes to understand, for purposes of clarity, whether Earth intends to continue its current relationships with non-council species if full reinstatement is achieved." The room was quiet. I said, "Yes." Thren said, "As council members, Earth would be expected to observe the non-interference frameworks that govern member relationships with non-aligned species." I said, "Earth will observe all frameworks that are consistent with obligations already entered into. Our existing cooperative relationships predate any reinstatement and they will not be dissolved. If the Council's frameworks require us to abandon 31 civilizations that trusted us when no one else would, then we have a different problem than the one we are currently discussing." Another silence. Vorath spoke for the first time since the opening pleasantries. He said, in his careful, aged voice, "The relationships are grandfathered." It was not phrased as a question. It was phrased as a decision. And because Vorath was still, despite everything, one of the most senior figures in the Keth delegation and the Keth were still one of the most influential voices on the council, what he said had weight. Thren nodded once. "The existing cooperative relationships are grandfathered under the reinstatement terms. They will be documented and will not be subject to non-interference frameworks." Alice Ward, who had not spoken for the entire session, leaned slightly forward and said, "We will need that in writing before signing." Thren looked at her. Then nodded again. "Of course." That was the moment, I think, though I have been asked many times to identify the exact moment. That was when the shape of the new arrangement became clear, not just the words, but the reality underneath them. The council was not readmitting humanity. It was acknowledging that humanity had built something outside its walls that could not be ignored or undone, and it was choosing to incorporate that something rather than continue refusing it, because refusal had become more expensive than acceptance. 31 species. Fold match drives that their sensors could not detect. Terraformed worlds and systems the council had written off. Medical research that their pharmaceutical channels could not replicate. Reactors running in places where council infrastructure had never reached. And 11 frigates in Yulari space that had turned a council-adjacent fleet around without firing a single shot. That was what they were accepting. Not us. What we had built. Henry Cage produced the signing documents 2 hours later. They had been prepared in advance, prepared 3 years in advance, actually, because Ruth Dallow's intelligence contacts had been tracking the council's internal discussions for some time and we had known this conversation was coming, though not exactly when. The documents were printed on earth paper, which is made differently from council standard, heavier, with a texture that comes from the specific trees we use. I had been told by several non-human colleagues over the years that earth paper felt different. That it had a quality they did not have a word for but which they described, usually, as substantial. 17 council representatives signed. The Keth representative, who was not Voreth but a younger official named Verdask, signed last. He held the pen, a human pen, another deliberate choice, and looked at it for a moment before signing, the way you look at something unfamiliar that you have decided to use anyway. Voreth did not sign. He was not required to. He was an observer, technically, attending in an advisory capacity. He sat at his end of the table and watched the signing proceed and said nothing. When it was done, I stood and said that Earth looked forward to renewing its relationship with the galactic community and that we believed the arrangement reached today could serve as a foundation for something more durable than what had existed before. Thren responded with the appropriate formal language. There was a brief reception afterward, which our kitchen staff had prepared with some care, human food, properly labeled for cross-species safety, along with provisions suitable for several of the delegation's dietary requirements, because we had done our research and hospitality is a form of information. I found Voreth standing alone near the window that faced west, holding a cup of something our staff had told him was safe for Keth biology, looking at the Atlantic. I went to stand beside him. He said, without turning, "It is a significant ocean." I said, "One of several." He said, "The gravity here is higher than Keth standard. I feel it in my joints." I said, "Most visitors do. You get used to it after a few days." He said, "I will not be here for a few days." A pause. We both looked at the water. He said, "I voted for the exile." I said, "I know." He said, "We believed it was the correct decision. I want you to understand that we were not acting from malice. We were acting from a genuine assessment of risk. Your species was unpredictable. The rate of change was unlike anything we had modeled before. We made a decision based on what we knew." I said, "What you knew was incomplete." He said, "Yes." I said, "What you were missing was the most important part." He said, "What part?" I said, "That being underestimated is not the same as being small." He was quiet for a while. The light outside was shifting, the Atlantic afternoon moving toward evening, the kind of slow gold that Earth does in the hours before the sun meets the horizon, which is not something that many species have as part of their home environment and which most of them, when they see it for the first time, find either peaceful or overwhelming. Voreth said, "What was written in the notebook?" I looked at him. He said, "The Admiral Vasquez. At the Exile. You have mentioned it in 2 published accounts and declined to quote from it directly. I have always wondered." I said, 2 lines. The first, "They are afraid of what we will become." The second, "Give them 150 years. Voreth absorbed that. Then he said, "She was 3 years over her estimate." I said, "She gave herself a margin." Something happened in his face. Not quite a smile. Keth faces do not smile the way human faces do, the musculature is different. But something shifted, a small release, like a mechanism that had been under pressure for a very long time finally allowed to ease. He said, "I should not have enjoyed that story as much as I did." I said, "Enjoy is a strong word." He said, "Appreciated, then." I said, "Appreciated is fine." He finished the cup. Set it down on the windowsill. Looked at the water for another moment. Then he turned, and I am not certain, but I think, he inclined his head toward me slightly, not the full council bow of equal to equal, but something smaller and more personal, more like the gesture you make when you have been wrong about something important and you cannot say so directly but you want it acknowledged. I returned the gesture. He left the room. I watched him walk out with the careful precision of a being who had chosen discipline as his defining quality, and I thought that in some version of his life he might have been someone I genuinely admired. In this version, he was someone I had simply outlasted. I stayed by the window for a while. The evening came in and the room behind me filled with the sounds of the reception, conversation, the clatter of cups, the particular acoustic quality of a room where 15 different translator units are running simultaneously and producing a low, layered hum that sounds, if you listen to it a certain way, like the galaxy talking to itself. Ruth Dallow came to stand beside me after a while. She was 61, still in the middle of her career by current human standards, and she had built more useful things in her life than most people twice her age. She said, "Henry wants to know if you are ready for the signing photographs." I said, "In a minute." She said, "Alice Ward wants to review the grandfathering clause before we release the joint statement." I said, "Alice is correct. Tell her I will be there in 2 minutes. Ruth looked at the water. Then she said, how does it feel? I thought about the question seriously. I said, you know what it feels like. It feels like something that was supposed to happen, finally happening. Not a surprise. Not a victory, exactly. More like arriving somewhere you have been traveling toward for a very long time, and realizing that the travel was the important part. She thought about that. Then she said, Helena would have hated that answer. I said, Helena would have said, what's phase 4? Ruth laughed. The first clean laugh I had heard all day. I looked at the Atlantic one more time. The sun was almost at the horizon, a line of gold across the water that would last for another few minutes and then quietly end. Earth had been locked away and called a cautionary tale. Earth had been placed in a queue and then removed from the room. Earth had been told it would collapse in a generation, and then ignored for 150 years, which in retrospect was the best thing that had ever happened to us. We had used the silence. We had used the darkness. We had used every year of being underestimated to build something that could not be dismantled, and then we had waited, patiently, generously, carefully, until the people who had locked the door came to ask if they could have a copy of the key. We had said yes. On our terms. I turned away from the window and went back into the room, and the conversations continued, and the evening deepened, and somewhere in the Earth's outer system, a fold match vessel was passing through a fold in space so quietly that nothing in the galaxy would ever know it had been there. That is what we had built in 153 years of being untouchable. Not an empire. Not a weapon. Not revenge. Just the capacity to move through the universe on our own terms, in our own silence, at our own pace. And the patience to wait until that meant something.